So for those of you new to the podcast, I have for years been doing the podcast as kind of my full-time primary thing, and I have dipped into savings. I have cashed out Bitcoin, cashed out retirement accounts, but it has not yet become a full-time income. I say yet. So I'm picking up some extra work, professional gunfighting, as you might imagine, making that mercenary money to stack it up. But the goal is still, God willing, to make this the full-time income. So you're going to hear some more recycled content, some more tactical reload content. Now, not today. This is new content. Just giving you a warning. I thought of something new for this week. The 20th through the 25th. Go to the Patreon page if you've never been there. Sign up as a free patron. There's a thing to sign up for as a free patron. Now, a lot of that content usually I put out for paid members. But this week, if you're listening to this when it comes out, or in the future, you can go back and listen to this content. The content coming out from the 20th to the 25th every day, there will be a Patreon page exclusive content episode only on Patreon. You can sign up for free. I mean, if you want to sign up as a Patreon member, you've been thinking about it anyway, go ahead. But just to give you a little taste of what Patreon gets, you can sign up as a free member and get that content. So scroll down, hit the link, and get Patreon only content that won't come out on the regular podcast. To give you an idea of things coming out for the Patreon page only that week, End of the World 2024 episode. Water is not everywhere. Practical Tactical Fashion Part 1. Practical Tactical Fashion Footwear. Anyway, that's some content that'll be coming out on Patreon. Patreon only. So go to the Patreon page and sign up. Sign up as a member. Check out the content that's only there. Now to the content. The greatest combat handguns of all time. That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. If that interests you, stay tuned. Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting tactics, a little bit of gun history, the right way with Almighty God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I'm blessed to be your host. I'm going to throw in a real quick rapid-fire bio, and we'll get into the topic. Private contractor, competition shooter, lifelong hunter, guide. Blessed by God that He got me through all those things so I could share this firsthand training, knowledge, experience with you to serve you today. Let's dive into the podcast. Now, we're talking about the best combat handguns of all time. Did a whole other episode on kind of what is and what are the attributes of a combat handgun. I'm not going to rehash a lot of that today. Accurate, reliable, shootable, longevity. That's what we're talking about today. Caveat, we're not talking about the most historically relevant or in the most historically relevant order. That will be a different episode in and of itself. We're talking about best effective combat handguns. This is Gunfighter Life. I have said before, I'm not going to bury the lead. I have said before, I think that the best combat handgun ever fielded on Earth, within the firmament that we have, the Beretta M9/Beretta 92. It is elegant. It is reliable. It is crazy accurate. It has beautiful ergonomics. It's very shootable. It's a great handgun. I like the operating system a lot better than most modern tilting barrel systems. I like that falling block locking lug system. I think it's a better system. I think it's just more expensive, which is why it's not as common. I think it's the best combat handgun, period. I might get some flack from that. I know that the Beretta has a lot of haters. Now, I'm not saying it's the best carry gun. I'm not saying it's the best CCW gun. And not because it's big or heavy, but because it's double single. And I think double single action is fine for a combat handgun. It is not my preferred for a carry gun. There are variants that are single action only. If you're looking at it for a carry gun and you're not, adverse to a safety, I prefer single action only variants. If it's a carry gun, if it's a combat handgun, double single is fine. But I think that the Beretta is a fantastic combat handgun. It is rugged, it is reliable. It served for quite a long time and is still serving in many roles around the world. The Beretta 92 or the M9. And it does all that rugged, reliable, robust, while still being accurate and elegant and fast and mild recoiling. It's a beautiful gun. It's a good performer. It is, I think, the best combat handgun ever, period. Now, it has a very close rival. The SIG 226 / 229. I would still consider the 229 a combat handgun. The 229 is slightly smaller, but I still think a combat handgun size. But the SIG 226, there's a lot of mark variants, military adoption variants, but let's just call it 226. It is also very, very good. It has a lot of the same features that came around in that kind of 80s era when it was metal on metal, kind of one of the last of the breed of that genre, metal on metal combat handguns. Aluminum frame, steel slide, grip panels, a lot like the Beretta 92. It was the big rival to the Beretta 92. It lost out to the Beretta 92 on the XM9 trials. It did not become the M9, the Beretta did. But it's still a fantastic handgun, and it's still been used by a lot of military and law enforcement. It is phenomenal. Much like the Beretta, it's a double single action. Again, I think great for combat. Perhaps not great for a CCW or a carry gun, but there are, again, single action only variants. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal combat handgun. It's a little bit simpler design. It does have that simple tilting barrel design, locking lug on the hood that is very common, that most modern handguns, the vast majority, have that system. It is a simple system. It is, I think, a little bit cheaper to produce, which is why it's so common. I'm not saying it's better, but it works fine. There are some pros and cons to the Beretta versus the SIG 226, which could probably be its own episode. Maybe one day, God willing, it will. But the SIG 226 is a simpler design. It is, I think, every bit as rugged and robust as the Beretta. I think it's a little bit less elegant and refined than the Beretta. But it is a fantastic combat handgun. Fairly similar in capacity, fairly similar in size, a little bit different in ergonomics and controls. Although they may look very similar, they are completely different operating systems. I prefer the Beretta operating system. But that said, it's really, really, really close. I'm kind of splitting hairs when I'm talking about the SIG 226 versus the Beretta M9. They are both phenomenal combat handguns. And I think they jockeyed out for the best combat handgun of all time. And with that, the much earlier but still good modern combat fighting handgun that was around a lot longer. If I say what year it came out, you'll know what it is. The 1911. It has stood the test of time. The 1911, as far as historical relevance and actual combat use goes, is probably number one. But we're talking about modern combat effectiveness. At least that's how I'm defining this episode. I like 45. But for a modern combat handgun, the other two are better. If you said you're going over right now, you're deploying to Israel to fight radical Islamic terrorists that want to cut off Jews and Christians' heads and do unspeakable things to their women, and you can have one of those three. I might debate whether I would take the 226 or the Beretta, but I probably wouldn't take the 1911. That said, if you said you got to carry a 1911 because you're going as a private contractor and that's what they issue, I'd say rock on. I'd say rock on. 45 rounds to the dome for all the terrorists. And there are some, again, it stood the test of time. I'm talking about a good modernized 1911. The Colt M45A1 probably be my number one choice, but a good Colt Combat Elite, a Colt Railgun, or a SIG GSR or something like that, a good modernized, good sights, things like that. Wilson Combat 47D magazines, or Wilson Combat, if I'm bringing my own stuff, would be great. I wouldn't argue with it. And again, that harkens back to the OG 1911 of 1911, well over 100 years old, and it has stood the test of time. So much so that if you said I had to go into combat with that handgun, I would say, okay, it wouldn't keep me up at night. That's crazy, because that gun was around when we had horse cavalry. Now we have air cavalry. And that gun's still good. It's crazy. John Moses Browning was a firearms genius. Give credit where it's due. So it is a fantastic combat handgun, and it has to make the list, although for a modern combat handgun, there's just been a lot of advancements and other things. I wouldn't put it in the number one spot. I would if we're talking about historically relevant combat handguns, but that's, again, not really the criteria for today. Now let's talk about the plastics. I actually begrudgingly really like the M17. The gun that beat out the Glock. The gun that spanked Glock's little hiney in the XM17 trials. And you can like that or not, you can throw a fit, wah. But it beat Glock. And I think it's better. I didn't want to actually like the gun. In fact, if you'd asked me when they were doing the trials and I was picking for the military, even though I don't generally like Glocks, I would have probably picked it for the handgun. It just made the most sense, I thought. Now, after several years of having and running an M17, I think they made the right choice. I really like the M17. I didn't want to, begrudgingly at first. I'm not the biggest fan of polymer striker-fired handguns. But guess what's on my hip today? M17. As far as polymer striker-fired handguns go, it's one of the best. It's lightweight. I also have a SIG 226 single action only. I do carry that. I'm not carrying it today. But the M17, also the M18, it's the smaller compact version of it. It has a lot going for it. It's the first mass-adopted combat handgun, for us at least, that takes an optic. And although some of the newer Glocks take an optic, I think that was kind of a hashtag me too. How can we do as little as possible and put an optic on our handgun for the Glocks? The SIG optics mounting option is better, I think. The SIG M17 is a better gun, in my opinion, and a better combat handgun. Now, there are situations where I would take a Glock over it. But I like the M17. It's got better ergonomics. It has a much better trigger. It's still a polymer striker-fire trigger. It's not a Beretta. It's not a SIG 226, and it's certainly not a 1911, which has one of the most exquisite triggers in history. But it has a much better trigger than a Glock. I mean, it's not hard to do, but they're both polymer striker-fired handguns, but the triggers are apples and oranges. It's just such a better trigger. And that's one of the big reasons I like it. It's got better trigger. It's got much better ergonomics, in my opinion. It has that natural grip angle grip. The Glock, unless you're just dyed-in-the-wool drinking the Glock Kool-Aid and you're just Glock, because it's got to be Glock, and if it's not Glock, you're wrong. Unless you're that dude, I don't know who the Glock grip angle is natural for, but it ain't me. If you don't shoot a lot or that's all you've ever shot, you may not notice a difference, but I certainly prefer a more traditional 1911 and other common grip angles on a handgun. I think it has better ergonomics overall, not just the grip angle. I often say that the Glock has a trigger like dragging a piano down a dirt road and the ergonomics of a 2x4. So the SIG M17 has really good ergonomics for a polymer striker-fired handgun. It's also modular, which I don't think honestly makes a lot of sense for the military. I could be wrong, but I do think it makes a lot of sense for the end user as far as if you're going to carry one. And now you can get different variants. The M17 is, for all intents and purposes, military adopted variant of the 320 with a thumb safety and optics mounting and some other things. But it's fundamentally the same, and it has that same system. It's a great handgun. Again, begrudgingly, when I got it, I got one used for like $400 and some. I was like, I'm going to beat the crap out of it, mount an optic on it, train with an optic, and then I'll probably sell it and be okay because I bought it at a crazy good price. And I haven't sold it. And I'm not a gun collector, which tells you that I really like the handgun. I bought it just for a trial to be like, I'm going to try the military's new handgun. And it really won me over. It's a great combat handgun. Especially, I would put it for the #1 polymer striker-fired combat handgun. And that says something, because there's a lot of good ones. Number 2, I'll give it to the Glock. Okay. Glock, again, does have the ergonomics of a 2x4 in my opinion, and it's like chewing on gravel when you're pulling that trigger. It's just not very pleasant. But to give the Glock its due, it is crazy rugged, it is crazy reliable, and it's crazy simple. It has far less moving parts. It's less complex even than the M17. So it has a lot going for it. Again, I said I wouldn't always choose a Glock, but if you said lowest common denominator, I'm going to give you a gun and you got to throw it in a porta potty and leave it there for a week and come back and carry it, I'd probably pick the Glock. I don't know why I would do that, but I will concede that it is probably one of the most reliable, simple, forgiving of neglect handguns on the planet. For that reason alone, it deserves to be on the list for greatest combat handguns. There are some sleepers that not a lot of people think about that I think should be on this list. The H&K USP, phenomenal. It never saw the widespread success of Glock or the now M17 or the Beretta M9, but the H&K USP has a lot going for it. It's got decent ergonomics. It's polymer, but it's hammer fired, which makes it kind of an ugly duckling, but it's a phenomenal. And you can kind of pick your own adventure as far as carry gun. Remember how I said I love the M9 and it's a great combat handgun, double single action, but I don't like it for carry? Well, there are different variants of the HK USP, but your standard variant, you can carry cocked and locked, like a 1911. You can carry it double single. It's a good multi, again, kind of pick your own adventure combat handgun. It's absolutely rugged. It's absolutely reliable. It hasn't seen the widespread success of the other platforms, but it has seen quite a bit of adoption among agencies, among different places, different governments, different countries. It is a rugged, reliable, absolutely good combat handgun. Polygonal rifling, however you enunciate that. They make really good barrels, really robust, and actually, I think, pretty mild recoiling for what they are. Even amongst polymer handguns, they're pretty mild in recoil. If you said that I had to carry a polymer handgun and you gave me the choice between and I don't like 40, but you gave me a choice between a 40 caliber Glock and a 40 caliber HK USP, I would much rather shoot a HK USP and 40. In fact, I don't think it would even bother me very much. But you're fighting uphill when you're shooting a Glock 40 cal, which was my first police-issued duty sidearm for LAPD. It was a Glock 22. Horrible handgun. But a 40 and like an HK USP, not so bad. Because it is really good at taming recoil. That's kind of the reason I brought that up. The HK USP is kind of a sleeper, kind of overlooked, and a phenomenal handgun. And although, again, not mass adopted, it has seen a lot of use in smaller pockets throughout the tactical industry over the past several decades. It's a phenomenal handgun. Another kind of sleeper, because we don't really think of it here, but we're not the only country in the world. I hate to break it to you. I love America. I've spent a big chunk of my life defending America, both overseas and CONUS here in the States. But there are other countries that make good handguns. A phenomenal combat handgun that's kind of overlooked here in America, but has a lot of variants and a lot of followers around the world. Believe it or not, there are other civilian populations that can own handguns. It's not just the U.S. But the CZ75. It even predates a lot of the guns we talked about. Not the 1911, of course, but 1975, that's a little long in the tooth. The CZ75 is phenomenal. It has a fairly unique operating system. It's different than a 1911. It's different than the Beretta M9. It's different than your common Glock SIG 226 type operating systems. But it's a good one. Although CZ75 is different in that respect, the CZ75 has a lot of copies. A lot of other companies copied that CZ75 because it's a good design. But the CZ75 is a phenomenal combat handgun. It has one attribute kind of quirk that makes it kind of unique other than the lockup system that I aforementioned, and that is that the slide rides inside the frame. If you look at most handguns from the 1911 forward, you have a slide that goes on the outside. If you think about the rails, the slide goes on the outside and the frame rides on the inside of the rails of the slide. The CZ is the 180 of that. The CZ slide rides inside the frame, which has its benefits and detriments. It might be harder to get a full purchase to clear a malfunction, but also slides a little bit smaller, sleeker. You may have less reciprocating mass. It is a fairly pleasant gun to shoot. The CZ75, it's a good gun and a good combat handgun, although we often don't think of it here in the U.S. I think a good modern combat handgun. The thing to test for that for me is if somebody said I had to carry it into combat, it was a noble goal, a noble cause, I wouldn't fuss about it. I wouldn't cry if somebody issued me a CZ75. It's a phenomenal gun. Now, there are a lot of other really good combat handguns, but I think the ones that deserve to be on the top of the list that make this episode cut, I think that's a pretty good place. And also other variants, right? If I said the Glock 17, the Glock 19 is also, again, a decent combat handgun. It's much smaller than that. I would not consider it a combat handgun, but the Glock 19, again, the 226 and the 229. The HK USP has a bunch of variants, the Expert, the Elite. The 1911, but remember that not everything that looks like a 1911 runs like a 1911. There's a bunch of cheap garbage copies of a 1911 that doesn't make it as good as an actual combat quality 1911. Wilson Combat, Colt, guns like that. Cheaper knockoffs are just that, cheaper knockoffs, so keep that in mind. But there's a lot of variants of that was kind of the point. But these, I think, are some of the best combat handguns fielded in the world. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you think there's a gun that should have been on the list that wasn't, again, there's a lot of other good combat handguns, but that are really historically are or have been used and are proven combat handguns, not one you think should be a combat handgun, but one that has actually been used in these kind of roles. Let me know. Let me know in the comments. If you like this content, on that note, there is a lot of Patreon-only content for patrons, contents for the Patreon page that you just don't get unless you're a patron. If you want to support the show, if you enjoy the show, if you get some value out of it, consider becoming a patron. Now, this is not a bunch of other posts, but this is just this week, and I'm talking about when I'm recording this. You may listen to this later, depending on when I put it out, maybe weeks from now before you hear it. But here are some of just the episodes they get that you don't get as a regular listener, just this week. The day I'm recording this, top 4.5 45 ACP handguns of 2024. Patreon-only random thoughts episode. Gunfighter glitches, which is like common mistakes that I see people make in gunfighting. Pre-attack indicators. And shotgun thoughts. Talking about thoughts on what's important for a fighting shotgun. Those, again, are Patreon only. They're for the Patreon page. Consider becoming a patron. There should be a link in the show notes. Anyway, with that, your tactical tip of the day. If you're doing tactical combat handgun kung fu type stuff, John Wicking with your handgun, you're likely going to get your magazines dirty, dropping them in the dirt and the gravel. I did that quite a bit this last week in actually going through training. And even with a Glock, yes, Glocks malfunction, especially if you get dirt and sand and gravel in the magazine. That's a thing. If you have ever tried to take the base plate off of a Glock magazine, talk about an exercise in frustration. You thought pulling a Glock trigger was nasty and bad and unpleasant. Try taking the magazine base plate off of a Glock magazine. They make special tools for it. That's how much of a pain in the butt it is. It's not like a Smith & Wesson M&P or a Sig 320 magazine or something like that. It's a chore to get those magazine base plates off, even if you have an easier magazine base plate to remove. The tip means that you don't always have to. Brake cleaner or carburetor cleaner or even isopropyl rubbing alcohol. Dump it in the magazine, spray it in the magazine, and shake it out. that should be a pretty good way to clean out most magazines, especially in a hurry. Every once in a while, you may want to completely disassemble them. Take out one of those bottle brushes, like a brush that you use for cleaning out baby bottles and things, and you can use that to clean inside the magazine pretty well. Every once in a while, it's good to do that, especially for like pre-combat type stuff. But just generally, you're going through a training class, you got day after day after day, you want to quick clean on the magazines, spraying them out with that brake cleaner, carburetor cleaner, things like that, and shaking them out can be a good way, especially on a Glock magazine, which can be quite the pain in the butt to remove the spring and everything. It's a good way to clean out magazines. That's your tactical tip of the day. Your tactical verse of the day. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. It is the second when Jesus is asked the greatest of all the commandments. We hear that a lot, love your neighbor as yourself. And amen, I totally agree. Jesus is quoting the Torah when he says that. Jesus is the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So I guess it's all one and the same. Not I guess, it is all one and the same. But let's read that in its context, in its original context. You'll find in Leviticus 19. You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Thanks for listening, men, and have a blessed day.